to the moon, to orbit the moon. The lesson we learned was in the system that was used in order to reach the moon, there was a problem with the issue with the amount of fuel that was needed and the amount of space in the aircraft that was needed to store the fuel. And the more space you have, the heavier the aircraft is. What should you do? And what we learned was is that the aircraft releases the space that holds the fuel after that fuel is used. In a similar way, we learned that there's one way of dealing with the evil inclination, is that you starve it. You starve the evil inclination, and by starving it for a while, you no longer have to hard knuckle it in order to win it. It doesn't mean that you've become a tzaddik, you've become a beinoni. It doesn't mean your palate has physically changed. But if you hard knuckle it for a while, so then the evil inclination for that specific thing is not the same after you've conquered it for a significant, depends on what it is, whatever. But for a significant amount of time, as you develop, you no longer need to focus so much on that issue. That issue becomes something you could release as part of the Yitzhahara that you don't need to deal with as much. Now we're going to go to another lesson we learn from this mission, page 129. There is another message that we can learn from another detail of the event. That page 129. When thinking about a journey in the air, there are two possibilities. One possibility is Aleph, the Dav Shekal Yisr min Ha'aver, Shyochel Harachaf Ha'aver, Shkos Rambam Shorich Kal Memayim Fichuk Brachaf Memayim Chulu. One method that may be used in order to fly in the air is to use something that's lighter than the air. Because it's lighter than the air, you could ride upon the air. Like for example, Maimonides says that the wind is lighter than the water, and that's why the wind is above the water. The second method that could be used to fly in the air is a bird. A bird flies in the air by moving its wings back and forth. With one wing it goes higher, with the other wing it pushes the air down, and with this pushing the air down it ascends. As is known the details about the original first aircrafts. But both methods only apply where there's air. In a place where there is no air, no oxygen, have only a little bit of air, so you can't use both of those methods when there is no air. So they found a way to solve this. That the aircraft itself should by itself push below. By pushing itself below, through this will be elevated above. I'm going to ask Dr. Bressman to explain that.
You want me to explain that?
Yeah.
So why does a rocket work? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Oh, because the thrust of a forward momentum exceeds the weight of the rocket. In other words, gas is coming out of the rear end and we're talking about a vertical rocket now. It's coming out of the bottom of the rocket at a force that's hot, that creates more pressure, more force. What is force? Force is mass times velocity than the weight of the rocket.
Okay. There's more force in what's released from the rocket
than
the force of the rocket itself.
Gravity, than the force of gravity holding the rocket to the earth.
Wow.
Okay, and then of course, as the rocket ascends, the force of gravity is less and less. So then the rocket doesn't weigh as much, and yet the little bit of force you still have left gets you into argument. Once you're in space, there's no gravity, and it's the Newton's first law, and it says when a body is put in motion, it tends to stay in motion unless an opposite force reacts on it.
Mm-hmm. So instead of the Rebbe is comparing this to a bird flying in the air.
That's different.
And that's different. How is it different?
In a bird, you explained it really well. One wing is pushing down while the other wing goes up, and it just does this. So the force created by the downward thrust it's like a fan. You know, if you take a fan, you know how hard it is to move, right? You have a big fan, you try to go like this, it's a lot of force.
The fan's hard to move?
No, I don't mean a fan like a whirling fan like this. I'm just saying, let's say, like in the old days, they had these big, not cardboard, but they had these big wooden paddles, and they would push like that, okay? Like this is a fan, right?
So that gets,
Okay, that's a fan, right? So you know if you had a very big fan and you moved it through the air, there'd be a lot of resistance. It's like walking through water. You walk through water, you have to, it's the same thing. So that bird is exerting pressure on the wing that pushes air down with enough thrust to lift that bird.
But with the spacecraft, it's not that way.
Well, the spacecraft starts that way because there is
air. Go ahead.
Okay, you know something? You're absolutely right. Okay, because you can launch a rocket from below the surface of the water where there is no air. Okay, it's just purely the thrust coming out of the back of the rocket. The bird is using its wings to create thrust.
Okay, but the rocket, what is it using?
It's
the gas.
Rocket fuel. Yeah,
the fuel.
Yeah.
It itself is making the
chemical energy stored in the rocket, okay, combined with oxygen, with air, or with oxygen built into the rocket, is enough to so violently ignite and expand the gases, okay, that they create tremendous thrust coming out of the nozzle. It's the same thing how a cannon falls. The cannon is a reverse rocket, right? If the cannon stays same and out of the rear end of the rocket, the cannonball shoots, right? That's a cannon.
Mm-hmm.
So a cannon and rocket work the same way. They're just aimed in different directions.
Airplane also.
Airplane is lift. Airplane is lift.
It's different.
Right.
It's different than an airplane because an airplane is there's still
Oh, that's
air.
a bird. That's a bird.
Right, the bird.
Right.
But
So
here
bird-
it has to be from the
Right. So now you have called Bernoulli's principle. So now you have, if you think about any airplane ring, the bottom is straight and the top has got a small curve, right? So when that wing hits air, the air has to split. Okay, here's the wing, here's the air. Okay, the air that goes under the bottom of the wing has much shorter distance to travel than the air going on the top because it's got to go over that curve. Okay, that means that you have to stretch the air. There's no vacuum. You have to stretch the air to get over the top of the curved wing, and so it all comes, at the same thing. The pressure becomes lighter at the top because the air molecules are stretched because they're being pulled, they're being pushed apart, and that bottom force lifts the plane. In other words, so a wing splits air, okay, and if you have rare air on top and heavy air on the bottom, the plane's going to be lifted up into the rarefied air.
Very interesting.
Okay, and of course you have forward force that makes it go.
But the unique thing over here that I was pointing out to is that once the aircraft leaves a place where there is air, it needs to itself produce whatever the air was producing.
Like a rocket. That's why we use rockets to get to space.
Right. So what does that mean for us? Now let's get the lesson.
Okay, that's your point.
No, thank you very much. I had no idea what was okay. So we said earlier, the way to be elevated is through Yetzer Hara.
Right.
The Yetzer Hara is the method that's used to elevate us. The resistance against Yetzer Hara is the thing that it's not just the reason why things are difficult. We said earlier is because Hashem doesn't want us to have shameful bread. He wants us to work. We asked them, why is it so hard?
Right.
The reason we said it's so hard is because the greater the force that you have to deal with, the higher you are able to go. The harder it is to
Okay, so
that only works though when that's the first part of flying.
So there's another Newton's law, and I can't remember which one it is, but it says that for every force there's an equal and opposite force. Okay, right? Because if the bullet shoots forward this way, the gun kicks back that way.
Interesting. Got it. Oh, so we could use the Yetzer Hara to be elevated. Just like in a regular situation of flying with a bird, where you're elevated by pushing the air down. And chassidus says that specifically through the opposition, through the resistance, you're able to reach. There's much greater force there. Like for example, chassidus says that when the sunlight reaches the earth, it's hotter than when it is close to the sun, because specifically when it's reflected, when there's something that's stopping the sunlight, then the sunlight. It's concentrated, it's more intense when it hits the earth. So the Yetzer Hara,
That's a little bit of a problem, because the sun is 93 million.
99 million miles away.
Yeah, it's millions of miles, 93, 99, but it's incredibly hot. I can't remember how many thousands of degrees centigrade. Whereas in the earth, it's 70.
Fusion. It's fusion.
They're not saying that in the sun itself.
distortion, yeah.
That was the chassidus says as it gets closer to the earth, when it gets far from the sun, it gets hot, the heat increases in the impact on the earth.
That's because the earth absorbs sunlight. Okay? If you go out on the beach and just wave your hand like that real quick, you don't really feel very much heat. You leave it out there for an hour, and you have accumulated
You see the similar
energy.
thing on the pool, for example.
Yeah,
My pool will take certain amount of heat from the sun.
right.
But if I put a cover on it, certain
doesn't get
cover
it, yeah.
with bubbles, then
Yeah.
it absorbs the heat from the sun and puts it into the,
Uh-huh.
and it's substantially hotter, 10 or 15 or 20 degrees hotter by taking, so it takes the same sunlight, the sun rays,
So you're using
does something with it. So the earth is the same thing. It has certain things that increases the rays of the sun to the heat.
the language we're using is because there's an opposing force. Because
Opposing
of the opposing force, using the word absorb, it sounds like a different thing over here. It sounds
It
like
is a different absorption. This is for every action is an equal and opposite reaction. So the question is, you kind of like ricocheting. What you're really doing is that you're using the entire force of in your example, you're using all of the Yetzer Hara, and you're saying, hey, I've risen to this height, I can jettison that part of my Yetzer Hara. Now my total load of Yetzer Hara is less, and now I can go faster with the same amount of energy that I'm doing. And if I get even higher and higher and jettison the second stage of my Yetzer Hara, it takes me even less force to go higher and higher and so forth and so on. I think maybe that would be
so basic point so far is like this. Basic point so far is that there is a need for the opposition of the evil inclination in order to reach a higher place. But the question is, what do you do when Mashiach comes? When Mashiach comes, there's no opposition anymore.
right.
So Hashem will remove impurity from the world.
Right.
Then we're only going to be going from higher and higher in Kedusha itself, higher and higher in holiness itself. And so too, nowadays also it's possible to be in a state of holiness. So how are you able to be elevated without an opposing force, like much as a rocket when it leaves the atmosphere of where there's air? And the answer is, as we see from the example of the rocket, that there can be an elevation from the rocket itself. And so too, Mashiach will come. It's possible that in holiness itself there are two opposing forces, like chesed and gvura. And by chesed and gvura, in holiness itself there are two opposing forces, and through this you could create teferes, something which is higher in holiness itself. And so too, when Mashiach will come, they will reach the highest level through the two opposing forces within holiness itself. That was the end of the conclusion of the discussion about the rocket. Then there was just two more points. In Eischav Dalet, if Farbrengen, they would discuss a whole spectrum of topics. First, they would discuss the Rashi. We're not going to go into the Rashi, but then they would discuss the Igeres Tshuva. They explained each Farbrengen at that time another segment of Igeres Tshuva. In the beginning of chapter 2 in Igeres Tshuva, it says that when you do Tshuva, you're not going to be called for whatever you've done in the world to come, to be punished, God forbid. But you still need, although the Tshuva achieves, there don't be any consequences for your deeds, you still want to become back in God's good graces, so to speak, by giving God a gift. And that's the meaning of the word kapara. Kapara is about additional level of being cleansed. And although the Tshuva achieves, you're not going to be punished, but to be cleansed, there has to be something more. That's the way people would fast, or other methods. Nowadays you shouldn't fast, as we learned. But the other things that are done in order to be as beloved by Hashem, so to speak, as before the sin. To be someone who's sinned against the king, the Alter Rebbe says he gives the king a gift to be back in the king's graces. So the question is, how come the Alter Rebbe emphasizes you won't be called out for this in judgment in the world to come? How come he just says the world to come? What about this world? So what the author is referring to is that this is different to a human court administering punishment. For a human court administering punishment, tshuva doesn't help. Why? Because a human court can only go by what it sees. You've done tshuva in your heart. The judge and the members of the Beis Din cannot see what's in your heart, and therefore they cannot take off your punishment just because you've done tshuva. Unlike the heavenly court, person's done tshuva, there's a different response there. Okay. There mentions that in Yeres HaTshuva, the Alpha talks about 3 kinds of atonement. There's a 4th kind of atonement he doesn't mention. The 4th kind of atonement is for Chilush Hashem, but desecrating God's name. Haka doesn't mention that because the Gemara says the way to rectify the sin of desecrating Hashem's name is death, and therefore doesn't mention that because it's not complete atonement. Elsewhere, the Rebbe said that it's interesting when the author begins Yeres HaTshuva, he says we learned at the end of Tractate Yuma. The teaching is not at the end of Tractate Yuma. It's a few pages before. It's several pages before. It's not in halachic terminology. It wouldn't be called the end of the tractate. And there, the reason why the author uses that term is because he wants to hint that although the Gemara seems to say there's no way to atone in your lifetime for desecrating God's name, yet there's nothing that stands in the path of tshuva, and therefore it is possible through a sincere tshuva out of love to rectify, even for the thing that the Gemara seems to say that needs to have death as an atonement. There's another. The author is hinting to this chiddush, to this novel idea that yes, there is a kapara for the 4th one that's mentioned at the end of Tractate Yuma as well. So here, the Rebbe continues the discussion and says that there's an argument about the meaning of chazaka, whether it's 3 or it's 4. Is it the 3rd time that establishes the chazaka, and then the 4th time is considered for sure that the same thing will happen again, or is it 2 times it establishes the pattern, and then the 3rd time will be assumed that it will continue? So he connects this with the discussion about the Alter Rebbe mentioning 3 times of atonement in the 4th. In the end of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe spoke about Rashi. In this week's Torah portion, Rashi says that Yaakov did not want to send Binyamin with his brothers, and Rashi said, why didn't he want to send Binyamin with his brothers? Because he was afraid of the danger of the road. So in that discussion, the Rebbe mentioned how when Shimon and Levi attacked the city of Shechem, they came upon the city and they were very secure that they were going to be victorious in destroying the city. Why were they so certain they would destroy the city? Because they trusted the power of the Ozakim. They trusted the power of the elder. They trusted the power of Yaakov. So Yaakov's children weren't concerned. Yosef, who knew about what's going on also, wasn't concerned. As Yosef told them, I can see with my silver goblet that you've destroyed a big city. So Yosef knew what was going on in the city of Shechem. He wasn't concerned. Yaakov's children weren't concerned about that particular battle because of the power of Yaakov. But here Rashi says that Yaakov was concerned because of the danger of the journey. Yaakov was concerned, maybe my sins have caused me to not deserve God's kindness. So the Rebbe continues this discussion, begins talking about the idea of being certain the power of Yaakov. They were sure that with Yaakov's strength they would be victorious. What does that mean? Being certain the power of Yaakov. So there is a concept that we learned in Parshas Vayetze that says that when Yaakov left the city of Beersheba, it says that the tzaddik is the light of the city, he is the splendor of the city, he is the radiance of the city. When he leaves the city, that all leaves. But the tzaddik is the radiance, the splendor, and the light of the city. But being certain the power of the elder, relying on the power of the tzaddik, is more than the tzaddik's light. When you say that tzaddik is the light of the city, what that means is that tzaddik prays for everyone in the city. Being certain that that's one concept. Another concept is that you were relying on the power of the tzaddik. Doesn't say the prayer of the tzaddik. It says the power of the tzaddik. That means even if it's something that the tzaddik doesn't even know about, like the story of Shechem, Yaakov didn't ask Yaakov for advice. In fact, Yaakov was against it. Yaakov didn't want to do this, and yet they were certain that since they did something for the sake of Hashem, Yaakov's power protected them. So there's one power that tzaddik has by praying for you. That's one thing. Here the tzaddik doesn't say to do it, doesn't even know about it, he isn't even against it. And yet, because he did it for the sake of Hashem, the power of the tzaddik protected Shimon and Levi when they destroyed the city of Shechem. And so too regarding our connection to the Rebbe.
It seems to have worked. It seems to have worked.
It worked. Same as regarding ourselves. If we only accept Mnem Ton, if we accept our tzaddik, our father, our elder, we accept him as our elder, then we can be certain the power of the tzaddik. And that's what we learned in the Farbrengen last night. The Rebbe mentioned, the Rebbe said in the Farbrengen that the chassid tells the Rebbe, Yehuda comes to Yosef called the tzaddik, and his Bi'adoni, I want you to be my Rebbe. I want you to accept me as your chassid. So as long as you accept the Rebbe as your Rebbe, and then you could be certain the power of the tzaddik, that he will accomplish everything, even things he doesn't even know about, even things he doesn't even want, because your intent is for the sake of Hashem. And since this is true, you have the power to enter one city, two cities, a whole country, and to spread the wellsprings of chassidus to the outside, and break through all the boundaries, as it was in the story of Purim, that no one stood in front of the Jewish people, and many people who of the nations of the world converted to Judaism, because the nations of the world, many people converted to Judaism because they were afraid of the Jewish people. I don't know if this was the Farbrengen, but there was one Farbrengen that mentioned Purim. All of a sudden, everyone was surprised about it, and there was some Israeli mission that was happening at that exact moment. You know what I'm talking about? Was it 1969 in Tavis? I don't know, but another Farbrengen that mentioned something about Purim. No, the nations of the world were afraid of them, and that was apparently a blessing to this mission out in that.
You're going to find out for us.
I'm going to find out people there. Okay, so just like it was in the story of Purim, coming from Chanukah, praying for Purim, that no one stood in front of the Jewish people, and many non-Jews converted to Judaism because they were afraid of the Jewish people. So too we will merit to the Gul Mitzvah Shlema, the coming Mashiach, may he come and redeem us, B'kar of Mamish. Or the power of the tzaddik, not just the prayer of the tzaddik, but the power of the tzaddik. L'chaim l'vracha.
You see in a relationship, any relationship, whether it's friends or